view on nature and biodiversity investing. On this panel, we're going to be looking into fixed income solutions. And we have an amazing lineup of speakers here. Welcome. I would like to start with a quick introduction from each of you, like a minute or so. Who you are, why are you in this space, what is your cause? Tell us about that.
Starting with me?
Yes, please.
Sorry, I got in from Jakarta at 1 a.m. in the morning. So I had time to shower, change, and come over. At any point, I may keel over. So my name is Chami, and I spent 25 years at the IMF. And while at the IMF, I happened upon nature-based solutions, what now everybody calls nature-based solutions. And originally it was about valuing services of nature. I started with the whales and the elephants, and then seagrass, salt marsh, mangroves. And from then on it took off to the point that I decided to retire early from the IMF and spend most of my time with my colleagues, Rogers here, and others, building markets around nature that are nature positive and people positive.
Amazing. Thank you. Gwen?
Gwen Yu. I'm with JPMorgan. I head up our nature and biodiversity globally. Prior to this, I was in markets, in structuring within our sustainability center, also within the ESG sustainability space. Before that, I was heading up sustainable business strategy for a European bank. And within that, just been in sustainability since the aughts, really. And have also done quite a bit of policy work with setting up the TNFD on the IWG, and also for the European Commission on the platform on sustainable finance.
Great. Martina, can we hear from you as well?
Yeah, with pleasure. Martina Macpherson. In my day job, I'm heading the ESG product strategy and management function at SIX. That's the Swiss and Spanish Exchanges Group. I've been also maybe an elephant/dinosaur in the room. I've been in this space for almost 25 years now, both buy-side, sell-side, meaning I started in investing in banking and then moved over onto the service provider side, part-time academic, visiting fellow at Henley Business School and University of Zurich. I'm researching areas such as biodiversity, as well as, interestingly, other regulatory topics, which we'll come to at the end of this discussion, which is increasingly, I think, also an important area of emphasis here for rules-based approaches in this space. And I've been involved in various working groups, membership organizations, such as the Future of Sustainable Data Alliance, that really aim to bring clarity, transparency, but also make and move impacts in this sphere between data and investing. Nice to meet you.
Thank you. Rachael?
And I'm Rachael Barza, the lead for climate adaptation and nature finance at EBRD. I'm not Harry. He's offered this opportunity for me to join the conversation since this is core to my area of work. So EBRD is a multilateral development bank, and we invest in the green economy transition, but also other transition activities as well, and general investment in our country's operation. And I came to EBRD and to nature finance from a climate adaptation perspective. So previously I worked for humanitarian organizations on evaluating their disaster response and preparedness and recovery initiatives, and moved from that obviously to climate and physical hazards, consulting with governments and private clients on how to prepare for the increasing physical risks that are coming, which nature-based solutions offer a lot for. And so when I joined the EBRD, it was as the director for climate adaptation, and on my first day they said, and also we're adding a nature finance to your role. So I said, great, I'm going to hire somebody who knows a lot more about that than I do, and I'm going to learn a lot very quickly. So I have a very resilience-oriented perspective, but learning a lot more about the space for pure biodiversity benefits and more into the other ecosystem services nature offers.
Amazing. Thank you very much. Well, I'll start with Gwen and Ralph. Considering your in-depth of knowledge in this space, I really want to understand, how can financial institutions really integrate fixed income strategies into their nature-based solution portfolios?
Thank you. So I think a lot of the conversation that we heard earlier on metrics that would be used on either the exclusion or inclusion part would probably be quite similar for fixed income. What's probably important to kind of dig into is what do we actually mean when we talk about fixed income products, right? Primarily, we're going to be talking about green bonds or and I put blue bonds under green bonds because the use of proceeds will be a similar type of assessment. Then we're looking at outcome bonds. There are new things out there like debt for nature swaps, which isn't necessarily new because it's basically debt refinancing. But then you have other options in there where we could potentially look at it. But if you look at what is mainstream now, then that's it. And if you take SFDR, kind of Article 8, Article 9 as a proxy, fixed income is like 20 to 40%, depending on if it's 8 or 9. And if you dig into those 20 to 40%, there are very few funds out there that are publicly listed companies, right, or publicly listed fixed income that are going to be focusing on nature or biodiversity as a whole. And I think we're starting, and it's going to be the same for indices. It's a handful at the moment. And if you dig deeper, then there's a lot of client ask going on right now in terms of, well, what does this really mean? What should we be looking about? And then it would be, what we're doing right now is a similar approach as to what we've done with equities.
Amazing. What do you want to add, Ralph?
Could you ask me the question again?
Yeah, sure. We're talking about the mechanisms and metrics
Indonesia.
for integration of nature-based portfolios into fixed income.
So you want to integrate fixed income into the corporate decision making?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, first of all,
Metrics,
because then the question you have to go back one step, which is whatever you do on the fixed income has to be part of something. So I would link it to the ESG.
Yes.
So corporates, they have an ESG objective, and then what you do is you link the fixed income to it through the instrument, through metrics. So I can discuss each one of them. So on the instrument side, yes, there is blue bonds, green bonds. I would not include blue bonds under green bonds because blue is much bigger than green. Will be.
Not in the market now.
Yeah, you're right. In the market now, yes. But I'm biased for the blue. So, and even those instruments, we have, all kinds of bonds, blue bonds, sustainability linked bonds. I hear about rhino bonds, all this stuff. But to me, that's old. In fact, all of these instruments do not recognize something very important about what we're all talking about here, is that nature is a new asset class. I challenge you to show me where in all of these pricings you recognize, whoever designed those instruments, that nature is an asset class. It's not there. These are all plays on philanthropy that are covered under the guise of a bond. I come from the markets. I don't come from the philanthropy world. When I looked at these instruments, they all to me look like a play on philanthropy, which is fine, but then talk about that you're generating money from philanthropy. But philanthropy will not finance nature. Philanthropy and governments will not finance nature. The financing gap is $700 billion a year. So we really need to wean ourselves away from philanthropic gains or targeting governments who are busy with other things. So if you want to talk to investors, asset managers, on that side, you need to make a value proposition. So I would link it first to ESG. Then within the ESG, so you start talking about, instruments, the traditional ones, but I would add to it nature-linked bonds or nature as an asset-linked bonds. I haven't seen anybody do that. I would invite you guys are finance guys, to start looking at it. We can dissect it if you like. Pick even debt for nature swap, same old, same old. I used to know the creator of it, Thomas Lovejoy, and he himself would agree that it did not recognize nature as an asset, meaning an asset that generates value. How do you bring that value into the bond structure? I haven't seen anybody do that. And so from instruments, you can design those instruments. The next thing is, that's the instrument, but then the metrics. Then the metrics, you take each letter of the ESG. On the environment side, the metrics would be, you link it to carbon sequestration, biodiversity, all that stuff colleagues spoken about. Then you take the next letter, the S, the social aspect. You link it now to impact on the communities, employment, other development types. And the G side, you still need to have a return. What's the return on these investments? If you will not be able to make any ground with the corporate sector if you cannot justify it on some kind of return. So you have to be able to link it to the return. And of course, then you abstract from all of that and you talk about advocacy on the policy side. Mm-hmm. And there we need the corporates to be to educate their investors. Because I talk to investors a lot, I talk to asset managers a lot, I talk to sustainabilities a lot, and they're clueless. Literally clueless. People do not understand, when we talk about investment in nature, we are not talking about the provisioning side of nature. That we know how to price very well. We're talking about the regulating side of nature. We know how to price a dead nature. We have a very good relationship with the dead nature. We have a very bad relationship with the living nature. We simply do not understand. So a regulating side of nature is the carbon side, is the biodiversity side, is nature living for itself. Does that have value? And the answer is yes.
Amazing. Well, I will move on to Martina because Ralph said, everything starts with the ESG, and then he actually talked about different, metrics under ESG as well. I want to understand from your point of view, how ESG is evolving in terms of, fixed income investment strategies, and what are the opportunities and risks you see there?
Sure, of course. I think one of the speakers mentioned that ultimately, when looking at the investment approaches in fixed income that apply to ESG, we look also at the three major areas. One is ultimately screening, the other one integration, the third one ultimately thematic investing. And then, of course, maybe as a fourth one, as an overlay, there's, of course, engagement too. Given that, of course, fixed income investors don't own the underlying entities or corporates within their portfolios. They rather obviously have a direct link and are exposed to issuers and the underlying securities. They can still engage individually or collectively with the issuers themselves. But then and there we come to certain areas where we can address fixed income on the corporate issuer side. And there was a mention earlier, a lot of credit research and credit information out on corporate issuers. But when and where, for instance, sovereign credit risks are concerned, and then also sovereign risk engagements are concerned, I think there is less so currently of an area of emphasis, even though if we take, for instance, the example of nature, it's estimated, and there was in a report in 2019, Verisk Maplecroft, that looks at sovereign risk assessments, came up with it, looked at $2.6 trillion are currently leading towards the destruction of nature. And these are ultimately lending activities, for instance, and or other banking activities, investment banking activities that directly contribute ultimately to the destruction of nature. Hence, there is the call for ultimately undertake much more research in these areas. Mm-hmm. It's also to be said that we look at sovereign risks. We had that discussion earlier when and where credit ratings are concerned. Credit rating agencies currently do credit worthiness assessments for issuers, and that actually is constituting a portfolio of around $66 trillion. There was one thing, and I'd like to correct it. They are actually credit ratings that are done on a trial for sovereign risk assessments, but they are not necessarily linked to the credit rating space. The Bennett Institute at University of Cambridge in 2022 came up with one of the first sovereign credit risk ratings and assessments. And that led to the fact that 26 countries globally would be downgraded and potentially could default on their debts, given that they would have an increasing debt of $53 billion per annum, ultimately linked to these type of activities, leading to the destruction of biodiversity and nature loss alone. So I think looking at these factors, it's terrifying, and understanding ultimately the hard work that still needs to be done, especially for fixed income investors that lack the type of underlying information, especially sovereign risk assessments, maybe less so corporate issuer assessments and credit research. There is a lot of research, there's a lot of ratings assessments already that have been developed in this space, but especially on the sovereign and sub-sovereign side, there's absolutely a data and an assessment gap.
These are very critical points. Thanks for sharing that. I want to move on to Rachael. I mean, EBRD is so instrumental in terms of developing markets, financing mechanisms and how they actually develop, and they lead the corporate world as well. So I want to talk about some examples of good, initiatives that maybe you can share with us based on, nature-based solutions and fixed income solutions.
Okay. I have to say, EBRD is still relatively new in the area of nature-based solutions. As a matter of fact, we developed our first large-scale NBS for resilience just last year and just signed out its implementation now. So I think it's useful to talk about our general framework for fixed income and how nature-based solutions fits into our own bond issuances, because it provides some lessons on what potential can be built into these products from an early stage. So the EBRD Climate Resilience Bond was issued in 2019, and it gathered $700 million of investment, and since then has been retapped a few times to get well over $1 billion. And it doesn't have any nature-based solutions in it. But the original framework was developed in a way that enables those solutions to be built in at a later date on second phases of the bond. So if you consider, for example, nature as infrastructure, as sort of a physical capital asset, looking at this River Bic project I'm talking about, our first nature-based solution is in Moldova. It's working with the river in Chisinau to support flood resilience benefits by sort of rewilding, regenerating the river to make it a bit more alive, integrating it a bit more with riparian areas, linking sustainable urban drainage solutions and rain ponds and little flood rain gardens to create a system that helps feed the river, feed these biodiversity stepping stones, and provides real value to the city, the ultimate borrower, in forms of reduced damages from flooding. So we now have this NBS asset, the first in EBRD's portfolio. And because 4 or 5 years ago when we developed this climate resilience bond, we understood that resilience investments could also include nature-based solutions and capital, that the framework is structured sufficiently flexibly that now we can put private finance into these NBS. So I think it's a lesson in, laying some groundwork and preparing for what you expect to come while still trying to be responsive to the fact that if you're creating a bond, it can't cover everything under the sun, right? It needs to respond to specific needs and demands from the market. But recognizing where those intersections are, I think, can really enable a lot of private finance to flow into fixed income solutions that may soon include nature-based solutions.
Great, thank you. Gwen, I want to ask the same question to you as well. Do you want to share some initiatives as well?
So maybe I can respond on what Rachael just said. I think that's a really good approach on how we're looking at traditional products and embedding nature or biodiversity metrics onto those products in our assessment process, because then that helps with the scalability and also the baseline capacity build that you're going to need to do internally with the people. So if I look at what could be a concrete example of that? So if I am in the DCM team and I'm helping one of my clients issue a green bond, then the use of proceeds, and it's an EU GBS green bond, then the use of proceeds are primarily going to be on a GHG emission link, right? Because that's what most people are looking at now. But if you dig deeper into taxonomy alignment, then you could also look at what is the DNSH associated with that particular business activity that you're funding, and what are some mitigation factors that you're putting in there. So if I were to kind of broaden that out more, then from a framework point of view, can I look at it as how have I mitigated harm? What is my exclusion divestment point kind of over time? Third bucket, then going back to your example, is how am I improving nature and biodiversity within that project itself? And then my end point, although I don't know when we're going to get there, is what does quote unquote nature positive look like? But if I'm thinking nature positive, if you are looking at economic activity, how do you then justify that? Because our economic activity would use nature as a resource. We will inevitably harm it. What does positive mean? Then people will talk to you about biodiversity credits. Sure, but biodiversity credits is not going to work like carbon, right? Because it has to be in situ, it has to be at the specific location. And if I kill the birds because I build a factory where it is, just because I put land next to it doesn't necessarily mean that the birds are going to come back.
Amazing. Thank you. I mean, we've talked about a lot of restrictions and difficulties, challenges. This is a very underfunded area, and we've talked about how much investment is needed in the space as well. So I want to ask Rachael and Ralph actually, how can we actually cope with these challenges and increase the amount of money flowing into fixed income for nature and biodiversity?
I think the fundamental challenge is the projects for investment need to be there. I mean, EBRD has had a very hard time with this. We've not yet managed to invest in a sort of forest carbon removals project even, which is often the sort of core of what you think about when you think about investable nature-based solutions, because there's a revenue stream associated with. But there's a lot of other operational risk, geographic policy principles that make this kind of project difficult for us. So we see the real need is very fundamental, is developing value and quantifying the value and making that value an investable proposition in nature. So if you look at the carbon revenues, that's there. It's fairly well established. It's variable, and there's risks, and there's different appetites for that. But there's a clear source of money coming in that can create income for a fixed income product, and that's just missing in a lot of what we want to do for nature. So it can go back into the earlier conversation about, is that biodiversity credits? Is that some way of commodifying other ecosystem services for resilience or for amenity values? Is that levies on the amenity value of different parks and cities, or is it fines? Where is the money coming from? And so I think that's the fundamental question that needs to be answered to enable finance to flow, because you need to finance something. I think there's a lot as well around the enabling environment that needs to be done that we can focus on in the interim while we're trying to build these revenue sources or justify the investment case. If you look at EBRD's countries of operation, for example, I think we're in 38 countries now, expanding to some in sub-Saharan Africa next year, which is quite exciting for us and might actually bring some new opportunities in this space. But only 11 of the sovereigns that we work with have issued green or social sustainability bonds at all. So that's not very many of them. And a lot of those aren't really drafted to enable future projects for nature-based solutions. So we've cut a bit of opportunity off from the get-go there. So what we are trying to do is engage in dialogue with our countries that we work with to, if you're thinking about a green bond issuance, make sure that it's going to meet future needs and enable finance to flow to the projects that you will be developing. We hope you'll be developing, and we hope you'll develop with us in the future.
Mm-hmm. Great. Ralph, do you want to comment?
Sure. So the question is about how to scale up. Is that what?
Yeah.
So to scale up, so there's a demand side of the equation and there's a supply side of the equation. I will tell you this, both sides need capacity development. Mm-hmm. On the demand side, sustainability officers don't know what they're supposed to know. Mm-hmm. I mean, just imagine if you take it, I'm being very honest with you because I talk to them. And it's like somebody walking into a tailor shop saying, I want a new suit. And the tailor says, what color would you like? I don't know. Would you like single-breasted, double-breasted? I don't know, I just want to look good. This is how it is right now. But keep in mind, the EU, the February 27 EU Nature Restoration Law, which was again adopted by the EU Council, is giving you 2 years. 2 years. And I can only imagine the panic that's besetting many of these small, medium enterprises, because not everybody is Apple, not everybody is Google, and they have to comply. Right now it's qualitatively, pretty soon it's going to be quantitatively. What does it really mean? It's basically telling you what is your net impact on nature, and if you're importing from the United States, you have to call up the exporter from the United States, say, in producing the widgets that you're selling me, what is your impact on nature in the US? That's not trivial. And you have the UK biodiversity law. So these things, so if you want to scale up, the first thing is to understand that the terrain around you is changing. It's not the old ESG. It's ESG on steroids. There's also the SDGs. So that's just the regulatory environment is changing around you. But within that, if you talk to asset managers, first thing they'll tell you, data quality. Don't talk to me about credit quality, data quality. Mm. How, people produce data, but I worked at the IMF for 25 years. A lot of countries produce a lot of data, which we actually don't believe. So it's not about the quantity of data that you produce, it's about the quality of the data that you produce. And it's not about that I have all of the data. I come from the markets, we can price imperfect information. But what we cannot price is knowingly incorrect information. Mm. So what you really want to know is, what is it that you know? My advice would be is to chronicle everything that you... So I work on also the supply side. I have Marita Coco, who's the visionary that developed the Hinemoana Halo project. I would advise you to talk to her. We're working very closely. This is the Polynesian effort that is actually taking blue and green nature to the markets, including developing systems to protect their whales and their oceans. We're working with Jeremy McCain here in the BVI, my colleague Roger. So we're on the ground and we see it. We find ourselves having to train to educate the demand side and the supply side. The demand side also want to know something that my colleagues here have been saying, the governance aspect of it. Investing in the Maori project in New Zealand, you don't worry about rule of law, right? You don't worry about property rights because that's really first world. But investing with the Maasai in Kenya or in Gabon, as we saw, in Gabon and other places, there's a political risk there. There's property rights are not well developed. There's a premium. Suddenly, it's not the same just because it's a mangrove project. A mangrove project here in the UK is not a mangrove project in Togo. So there's a governance aspect to this. So there's a data quality part, there's a governance aspect, and then also there's the informational asymmetry problem. So you want me to invest in something, in somewhere. So who verifies the verifier? If you're dealing with indigenous people, it's one thing. It's dealing with governments in countries, it's completely different animal. So who's watching the watch person? Who's watching the government? So I'm buying carbon of seagrass, which I work on that, right? So the first question the investor said, the government is going to be looking after the seagrass on my behalf? Yes. How?
Oh, yes.
Show me. Well, luckily we have technology, we have satellites, we have sensors, there are now things that by the way, there's a company that's going to launch itself this summer, I'll tell you this.
Yeah, but it all starts with the good intention. I mean, you can have all that, but if the intention is not right.
But it doesn't have to be good. This is, I'm sorry, I'm talking to my guild. My guild is nothing good. If you say anything, the word good, they'll say, go hug a tree. I'm being honest with you. They're saying, why? Because they're thinking, I either invest with you or I invest somewhere else. So it has to be a value proposition. It's not a philanthropy play. Yeah. It's got to be because you're going to make money from it. And they say, how am I going to make money? Well, you buy low and sell high. You buy the carbon credits or biodiversity. By the way, yes, biodiversity is localized, but you don't have to stop there. I worked at IMF on the CPI. You know what the CPI is, right? Consumer Price Index. We compare consumer price indices across the world. How do we do that? Do you know? We compare the deltas. So how you define the CPI in your country is your business. It's the uplift from that. It's the change. So we compare the percentages across countries. So you could do the same. So we have a biodiversity, yes, in a river in New Zealand, and you measure it the way you want to measure it, and then you follow it, the deltas over time. That's your uplift. I have my own river in Togo, and I take a higher risk metrics, okay, our friend, and she takes a snapshot and tells you, here's the baseline. Then I can do the deltas. Then I can compare perhaps deltas across countries. Suddenly biodiversity becomes, I can compare it across countries just as we do CPIs. There's many ideas like that out there. So scaling up involves also on the supply side that the indigenous people and the local governments understand the optionality of what they're sitting on. That's what I found most helpful from the work we do, is sitting with them saying, do you realize that for example, we work in the Bahamas. Bahamas has 30% of the global mass of seagrass, folks. That's 93,000 square kilometers. They can go up by another 40,000. That's a paper published in Nature. 40,000 is worth $150 billion. Why? Because when you have healthy seagrass, it's not only carbon. When you have healthy seagrass, you have delta on fish stocks. When you have healthy seagrass, it has a knock-on effect on coral reefs. When you have healthy seagrass, you stave off flooding. All of these we can do the market valuation of, and suddenly the ecosystem services have a market value. Mm-hmm. You add it all up, it's at least 150 billion.
Amazing.
Can I say something quickly about
Sure.
that market and supply and demand point? Because I think that's really important, and we have perpetual challenges with that matchmaking need and understanding what the buyers want specifically. So we can take them a forest carbon project in Kazakhstan and here, I'd rather see something in Africa just for my own purposes, my balance. We could have a wetland project in Turkey that helps with bird habitats, and they'd say, I'm really more interested in seagrass at the moment. So it's not just that there's a carbon credit value of dollars. There's also so many other criteria that you have to really match make, and it's just a perpetual. There's not a thick market for all of these different dimensions.
Totally agree.
Yeah.
Well, we're running up with time, so I want to get your last words before we close.
That's good for me, I think. We've got some projects, we've got some buyers. They need to agree the language, the needs, the terms, the standards, so we can put them together.
Cool. Martina?
Maybe we need some interoperability. You know, we haven't talked today about the different initiatives, frameworks, conventions, regulation, frameworks of normative and regulatory nature, disclosure frameworks, which again are of normative and regulatory nature. And what's causing, I think, a lot of confusion in the moment is when and where you're defining and identifying and then defining the relevant targets across asset classes. We're talking about the urgency. We've heard this morning from UNEP. We're talking about targets, not just climate, that go up traditionally for net zero targets up to 2050. We're talking about biodiversity targets alongside the global biodiversity frameworks, for instance, but also the other UK's and especially the EU's strategic restoration law and biodiversity strategy initiatives. They all look at 2030. So I think we have an urgency to understand now what we need to assess, how that aligns, and what ultimately makes an impact. And I'll leave it here.
Great, thank you.
I think if we want to start doing something, then we got to start with what we know and what we're doing now. How do we improve upon that? And then there's a lot of capacity build that needs to happen from the supply and demand side, because as you heard through the panel, most of the time it's either going like this or the clients don't really know what they want.
Exactly.
And then when you dig deeper, what they asked you to begin with may not necessarily be what they actually need or that will actually be good for the planet. And I will leave it.
Great, thank you very much. And your last words?
So I want to pick up on something the previous panel said, including with my colleagues. In fact, Eric said it. Nature is not a luxury good. We could play games with each other and waste time, and especially when people say, is the science there? Really? Yeah, science has been there for a long time. I think, as my mom was a professor, she'd say, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Get on with it. I think we talk a lot and we do very little. There's plenty of work for us to do. I think we should get on with it. Because whether we get our house in order or not, nature or the demise of nature is like a train coming at us, picking up at very fast speed, something you said earlier. It's not waiting for us to get our house in order. So I don't see why we keep spinning and people saying, oh, I need this to be right. We've all invested in markets. And, I remember being in CDO and CDO squared. How much did you really know about it? Okay? I mean, how many of you have ever touched a bond or a stock? It exists in the legal system. It's not a piece of land. It's not a real estate. Yet you'd invest in it because some big shot told you to do it. And suddenly when nature is in front of you and saying, help me because I've been looking after you, we start saying, well, let me think about it. Maybe I have time. We don't really have time.
No, we don't have time. Let's get a big round of applause for our panelists.